66 million years ago, an impact on planet Earth would essentially change everything for the species currently residing at the top and those scurrying underfoot. Then subsequently, the same asteroid would totally change everything with humanity concerning GTFO. When the dinosaur killer asteroid struck the planet that is hypothesized to have been between 10 to 15 kilometers wide, it would send material flying outwards into North America, raining what would essentially be hellfire down on anything walking around. That's if you weren't instantly vaporized by the resulting heat blast and shockwave. This asteroid had such an energetic impact, and considering the angle that it actually struck at, this would send material flying almost into orbit, allowing pieces of Earth to come back down on the other side of the planet and ensure that everything would be completely screwed. Ecosystems would rapidly fall apart as plants on the other side of the planet burned down in droves. The large herbivores would lose their food source, and any carnivore left alive would slowly begin finding that they couldn't find any food either. This would ultimately spell the undoing of large dinosaurs, resulting in a planet that would be devoid of larger animals. That said, the smaller ones were still capable of surviving in several ways. Smaller dinosaurs would eventually progress into birds that we know today. Some holdouts, resulting in modern-day alligators and crocodiles, would have been able to survive descending into the water to escape the flames and heat, and hunting what was left around, which was any surviving animals near them. And mammals scurried back into their underground burrows, which allowed them to be shielded from the flames and destruction above. Ultimately, the mammals would turn out to be the victor due to this disastrous but serendipitous turn of events. As the planet recovered from the nuclear winter and pioneer species took back over with plant life returning to the scarred side of the planet, mammals would find niches that allow them to evolve and change in ways that would ultimately culminate into one of the most intelligent species on the planet, capable of the most idiotic things. That means enter humanity, baby. While we are always number one, we have been known from time to time to literally introduce our calcium container into the land of colons and think that something is a good idea when really it was just a bad one from the drop. In fact, I have a suspicion as our species, we will definitely push a button thinking it's going to solve all of our problems, and it'll just open up a black hole in the center of the planet, removing any trace of ourselves. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is, we as a species are always naturally curious and want to test not only the limits of our intellect, which propels us forward with almost reckless abandon. Like, I'm being serious. We do not need nukes. We're a bunch of hyper-intelligent, anxiety-ridden primates splitting atoms. I don't know, guys. I wouldn't trust a chimpanzee with a force multiplier. That's all I'm saying. But anyways, the drive for this knowledge and to understand the fabric of our universe and nature of things while leading us to the highest tech level this planet has ever seen, or so we think, because we really don't know if there were potential societies before us, because all traces would have probably eroded away by now. But with this tech level, let's just say we aren't scared to go and explore and look for things that literally could spell our undoing as a species. But first, this episode is sponsored by Audible. Are you ready to start listening to thousands and thousands of audiobooks, original entertainment, and podcasts with a free 30-day trial? Heading to audible.com/Roanoke or texting Roanoke to 500-500, you too can achieve audiobook greatness. So currently I'm on vacation myself, sort of, and I have a lot of driving to do. By listening to an audiobook, it helps me remain engaged while driving, but also passes the time while doing chores, working out, and also cardio. With its ability to share a book with anyone if it's their first time, clip audio excerpts to share, the chapter navigation so you can pick up where you left off, and also having speed control to listen faster or slower for retention, there's never been a better way to listen to audiobooks, podcasts, or any genre you want, such as memoirs, mysteries, thrillers, motivation, wellness, business, and more. My personal favorite is actually the Halo series, because anything that's being shown on TV right now is absolutely not canon. So again, heading to audible.com/Roanoke or texting Roanoke to 500-500, you too can start your 30-day free trial today and begin listening to a massive library where you'll always have something new to discover. All right, let's get back to it. Now that's a great trait to a degree, except, you know, the undoing our species part. But there is something that has interested our species for quite some time. Wrapping up this intro, essentially, we knew giant lizards in some capacity existed for hundreds of millions of years, and suddenly mammals took the scene. Eventually, we found the root cause, which actually turns out to be the final nail in the coffin because Earth was kind of struggling with several things at this point that was chipping away at the fauna of the planet. Finding this crater in the Yucatan Peninsula, it absolutely fascinates humanity, seeing as this is essentially what allowed the paving of the way for us. Because I don't know about you, but raptors, given enough time, may have actually been the dominant species if they continued to grow in intellect. This area of the peninsula, known as the Chicxulub crater, is a carved out area of the planet over 150 kilometers in diameter that literally burned through the crust of the planet, remelting it and ringing the entire Earth like a bell several times. Currently to us, it's not known if any piece of the asteroid was left behind, but then again, we have never dug deep enough from a part of the cursory expedition to gather samples. Enter GTFO, appearing to take place place a little later in the future of humanity's story, humanity has dug deep down into the crater for unknown reasons, potentially having detected something down there, whether it be animal life, an energy source, or something else entirely. A lab would then be established by drilling deep into the Earth's crust where the impact site was, and at first, everything appeared to be going quite well. Starting maybe just a few hundred meters below the surface, tunnels would be dug out to denote future expansion sites, potentially to continue looking for more of what was found, as well as a central dig would continue to take place. This dig would have surface level entrance areas, but the lab would begin around the 400 to 600 meter mark concerning depth, with the deepest portions of the facility being well over a kilometer. Hundreds of labs would be constructed in this deep dig facility, all working on something that still appears relatively unknown, but would ultimately spell the scientists located there demise. It appears at some point in the deepest portion of this facility, an explosion would take place, sending a large spear-like object through the lab's rock and out through the surface. Once this explosion happened, things would only turn worse for those located inside. As the facility was abandoned by basically everybody once this happened, those that were stuck inside would turn into monsters, but all becoming hideously mutated from the same event, which we'll be covering in this video, but you need to know the lore before we can move on to the science. As the facility went dark, nothing down there would be left alive in its human form, or at least in a way that we could call it human. They're definitely still bipedal, but they have become nothing more than beasts at this point. So the question posed is, how did this happen, and what was the result of this event concerning the humans trapped inside? Well, it's sort of a tricky one. There are several events that appear to say it may have been a multi-stage issue. The first one being the material that we find all over the facility. This black material that hangs from the roof and walls in certain areas appears to suggest that some sort of biomass has infested this entire lab space. Now the question would become at this point, how did it even get there? Well, there are a few things that happen within the first level, so if you haven't played it, I mean, there's spoilers in here, but upon completing the mission for just a few moments, you are transported somewhere that is said to not be Earth. That would mean that portal technology with Earth tethered to a different world has been established, which presents a whole host of contamination issues. So what can we surmise may have happened based on the material that we find? Well, first, it's unknown what it is. Some have suggested it's a chemical that has begun converting the facility, but from what I can gather, the material would be more likened to something like a fungus or a mold creeping and growing across the entire structure. Now, I want you to bear with me as we talk about this material because there is still a lot of open speculation as to what is happening within GTFO, but to me personally, it looks like portal technology was being experimented with and someone was contaminated and may have not even known it. Bringing this stuff back to the facility unknowingly they were infected may have actually ended up infecting others deeper where these experiments were taking place. Because taking a look at the setup, those that were located within the deeper portions of the dig have the more extensive mutations, whereas those located more towards the surface appear to have been only recently impacted. But bear in mind, this has been taking place for years. So also as you descend deeper, you can find more and more of this material. Once the first person was unknowingly infected, it would begin spreading in the lower levels quickly, as it appears to be compatible with biology of humanity, or at least in terms of influencing our genetics in more grisly ways. It also appears reliant upon biomass in order to spread as well, meaning that while some were turned into these monsters, some were also likely just completely digested for biomass. We see there is likely an infection process for a few reasons, and not just the, oh my god, they've turned into monsters, or the monsters somehow entered the portals. The first and most glaring example being that these creatures are still very clearly in their humanoid form, and not just a humanoid form from some other planet, but they still look like humans despite their grotesque transformations. But we also find several clues throughout the facility of those that failed to turn into these creatures and instead just became bodied. Looking in certain locations, you can find humans curled up, faces down on the ground, covering their eyes. This photophobia tells us what may have been going on internally with the person, which says that this is not a chemical on the ceilings or walls, but something organic that may have been impacting their bodies as their infection progressed. Upon this hypothesized organic material, which we will get to sort of what form it may take in a moment, enters the human body, it's clear the immune system would respond quickly. Now, judging by what we see with the infected, it would be an airborne infection drifting through the dig site. And now I can hear you now. Roanoke, how do you know that though? Well, let's take a look at today's topic, the lowly sleeper or early striker, to get a good understanding of the infection pathway and why I believe it is as described. Starting with the feet of the sleeper and striker, we see that the skin has essentially molted into what would just be a solid covering. The toes are no longer well defined in this area, indicating that growth within the skin cells has continued, potentially even joining splits in the area into one solid mass that would be quite calloused. Moving up to the legs, the soleus and gastrocnemius are in their same form, which would indicate that the tibia and fibular bones are still there in their standard forms as well. Note the lack of mutation really in this area, as it will be important later, because the feet are always important. Moving up to the thighs, we see much of the same thing. The mutation mutations are not as prevalent and in their regular human form, which would indicate that this thing really was once human and likely not from some unknown planet or plane of existence. But getting to the pelvic region and upper thigh region, we begin seeing things have kind of gone awry. Now with the kneeling sleeper, we don't really see it, but with the standing striker and sleeper, and just so you know, they're sleepers when they're sleeping, but I suppose we could just call them strikers. We're just gonna call them strikers. We see that whatever sex they used to be has long since been lost. Around this area exists bulbous growths indicating something just below the surface of the skin. These growths will be talked about when we get to the internal changes to the body. But with these growths, they continue up into the abdominal region, completely distending and distorting what is naturally there concerning abdominal muscle. Moving up to the chest, we see it lights up and has a red glow to it, likely due to the tissue being in the way, meaning that the original light would be quite bright to move through that much tissue. It's sort of like putting a flashlight over your hand. Take an LED or very powerful flashlight and you can actually see through your hand meat. Now, don't look into it because that can straight up damage your retinas. But even as powerful as it is, you can just barely see it. Now extrapolate that out to a rib cage and the pectoral muscles, and you'll see that this has to be incredibly luminous, but the chest remains exteriorly largely unchanged. Moving down to the arms, we see that these are relatively in their normal forms as well. And I say relatively because moving down to the hands, most of the time the hands are just either completely missing or the fingers have gone missing. This is probably for several reasons, but likely they were just really bitten off. Because getting to the head of this creature, this is where the fate of the human is shown in its worst form. The head is split down the middle with the eyes flanking either sides, although the eyes are likely largely useless by now and really just a side feature. The ears also appear on either sides of the head, and hair on the body has been completely lost. Concerning this split down the head, it runs from where we would expect the mandible to sit on a human all the way back to likely the location of the cerebellum. This would indicate that the brain has largely been destroyed, mainly because this is literally what it used to chew up human faces and bodies, so new muscular connection points would need to be made where the brain once was. Within the skull also sits several sharp teeth, newly formed, probably from the skull but using the genetic information of the body. Internally, we see how the concept of the airborne infection is supported, along with other clues as to this being the case. First, taking what we know about the warden sending you down there in the first place, every prisoner is sent in to conduct these missions within the facility, standardly equipped with a gas mask to filter the air that they are breathing. Even still, in some areas, the infection is so thick and it's visible that your masks are not able to properly filter it out, resulting in your infection progressing. But also the strikers show us physically what is happening concerning this airborne infection. As the organic material drifts through the air and is inhaled by a person, this would be the exposure event that would ultimately turn them into a body or a monster. As it moved into the sinuses towards the back, exist nerve clusters that would allow it to actually enter the brain of a person, although it is not largely necessary seeing as it would continue to grow in the sinuses themselves. At first, this would likely just irritate the sinuses, causing people to sneeze and cough and likely have flu-like symptoms, but in sneezing and coughing, they would also be ejecting this material. The other interesting thing would begin taking place. Well, interesting from the perspective of you and I, because it sucks to be anybody infected with this. So your sinuses tend to drain, resulting in something known as post-nasal drip. As a person slept, mucus would carry this organic material down into the abdomen where nutrition is processed, which this will likely be important later to you. But moving back up into the respiratory area, we have the sinuses of the skull infected first. Due to the location of the nerves in the back of the sinus cavity, the brain would likely be infected next. But another area would also be hit pretty hard, and that's within the chest itself. Breathing in would seed the sinuses, but more of the material would also enter the lungs themselves. And this is where the bioluminescence would begin to take hold. We see that whenever this creature has its almonds activated from someone moving or is alarmed in some way, the heart rate increases as we can hear it thumping away in its chest. This would mean that extra pressure is applied by the heart, which would activate the bioluminescence. Because of this, at this point, I think we can stop calling it some sort of organic material, especially since I ruined the surprise earlier, and I just realized that after I wrote all this, but we can call it what it actually is, at least in my headcanon, which, you know, I'm just saying, may become right at some point. After all, a few years back, I was right about the Doom guy being the Doomslayer, and I had a ton of butthurt people saying, no, Roanoke, Doomslayer is a betrayer, and I was like, no, bro, read the lore, and they're like, no, you shut. Yeah, it was a great time. Anyways, I believe the infection is fungal in nature. First, even on our own planet, hundreds of different fungi are known to create a sort of bioluminescence for one reason or another. But the interesting aspect is direct pressure applied to a fungus can cause this effect to be more noticeable, which is exactly what I believe is happening here. As a fungus drifts through the air, it appears to have a profound interaction with us on a cellular level, entering the sinuses. It would continue to grow within the heads of people, which unfortunately for them would literally cause their faces and skull to crack open. Prior to this, as you might imagine, this would be quite painful, but it's the immune response that would get you first. We see photophobia exhibited infected by those who did not turn into this monster, but turned into a body as they hide their face and eyes. Extreme pain brought on by light is an indication of an infection within the brain itself, as the meninges is inflamed, causing meningitis. People with meningitis would have extreme pain when subjected to light, just to clarify. On top of this, the internal pressure of the brain would induce migraines to the point that really you would probably want to take yourself out of the game. These people would hide their faces as the pain would only get worse, resulting in, again, their skulls and faces splitting open from likely the internal pressure. At that point, however, the body is basically on life support. Because of the pressure internally, the neurons would be destroyed in the frontal, parietal, and mostly the occipital lobes. And I say this because, like, the temporal lobe, part of the occipital, the brainstem, and the cerebellum need to be intact because A, the strikers do respond to auditory cues, meaning that the temporal lobe needs to be functional in some capacity, and B, if you shine your flashlight on a striker, they will be able to feel the light or at least see it to some degree, meaning that the occipital lobe must be there in some capacity. But considering that we see the skull is split open, the frontal lobe is gone, and most of the parietal lobe, if not all the parietal lobe, are also gone. So for those who did not have their head split in time, this may be why we see people still in a human form in a similar position as the sleepers, because their body flatlined out before the mold could induce the changes necessary. For those that have their skulls split and relieve some of the pressure would by no means be functionally human anymore, instead relying on pure instinct, simply reacting to the environment in more animalistic ways. It appears, however, the mold can inspire growth from cells, as after the skull split, teeth would form and the throat would likely enlarge at the base of the split, allowing the creature to attack and eat people for sustenance. And we know that the fungus can actually inspire growth, seeing what we see later with other infected, but that'll be for another video. Moving away from the head and towards the chest, we begin to see why this would likely be a fungus. Again, because of the bioluminescence, that would be our first clue. Although there exists bacteria that does the same thing, but considering what is on the walls and how it is able to drift through the air and enter people's sinuses, to me this says fungus over bacteria. But a case could be made that something like a slime mold could be the culprit, as well as considering it's from another planet entirely, there may have been a fusion of the two branches, or they just never really split concerning kingdoms. Anyhow, as the warm, moist lungs allow for the growth of this fungus, it would begin spreading and filling up the lungs, or at minimum coating them. I believe this to be the case, seeing as when pressure is increased by the heart pumping more blood through the pulmonary artery, this would flood the tissue of the lungs with more blood, and this would put pressure on the fungus, activating the bioluminescence that we see. And with that, we also see the arterial presence as well as vein presence have been increased all over the upper torso, indicating blood to the head areas has been greatly increased, likely to fuel the tissue there. This means functionally that the lungs still work to supply the body with oxygenated blood, or the fungus itself may be providing the lungs with the oxygen as it runs through them. So this would indicate that the fungus has an aerobic metabolism and is quite reliant on the host for this oxygen, unless in a super colony like with what we see with the walls and ceilings in certain areas. As this fungus colonizes the lungs to a successful degree, it is also located within the gut of the human, where nutritionally materials are extracted from what's eaten. We see with the bulbous growths on the outside that a lot of them exist outside of the pelvis, but upon cracking open any of these creatures, we see several locations that internally they are riddled with these pods. These pods appear to be likened to that of a mushroom that is actively growing within the creature, just very slowly, because remember, it's been a couple of years. Now this growth may be a timing thing. Instead of destroying the host entirely, this may be just the first stage of infection process, at least with the strikers. Because again, the lower you go in the facility, the larger and more mutated the infected become. So given enough time, these pods may continue to grow the individual, but there may be a reliance on what sort of biomass is actually there and available for usage, or it could just come down to your actual immune system. Now the next question, we did touch on the immune system on this, but it's why does our response to the fungus not seem to work? Well, it's apparent to me, based on the positions that we find people in absolute agony, that the innate immune response was rearing up upon being infected. The macrophages will enter the lungs and attempt to destroy any fungus that landed there, which actually, if you didn't know, our immune system has to do that with almost every breath we take because the air is riddled with mold spores and our lungs are just absolutely perfect for growth. But with the innate, it's not perfect. Eventually it will become expended and run out of fight, which is typically where the adaptive immune system would come into play. But the issue also may be reliant on the host itself. Remember how I mentioned the skull doesn't crack open in time and the person expires? It's because it may all come down to this immune response. And those that have a properly functioning immune system, likely those are the ones that'll turn into monsters, which we'll get to in a second. If you have an even stronger than normal immune system, this may be able to hold the infection at bay for too long. Holding the infection at bay would mean that the macrophages and neutrophils are destroying too many of the fungal cells, but this is still resulting in meningitis, as even the host itself is damaged in the fight. Because of this, they are eventually bodied by the infection process rather than turning. We know in some people, their responses are too strong, which can result in their end, much like those who don't actually have even remotely a strong enough response. And this is just concerning regular infections. In this fungal infection, those that have too strong of a response meet their end, and those that have a normal response with innate activating, meningitis forming, and their adaptive not being able to overcome the infection, those would turn into monsters. Then you have the third variant of this interaction, meaning that these people may have had a lower response to the actual infection, meaning that they changed more quickly. And these might be the giants that you actually find in the upper levels, because they actually become more common in the lower levels, showing that timing also still plays an effect. But this allowed for their bodies to be quickly altered by the fungus and to be changed on a genetic level, which would also end up affecting the endocrine system, which then had an impact on the rest of the body. So how does the fungus sidestep the adaptive immunity then if it really just has to wait out the innate? Well, we know on this planet currently, fungi can do this in several ways by either having the CD4 and CD8 T cells disrupted somehow, like with HIV for instance. It destroys enough of these T cells, allowing for the fungi to opportunistically infect the body with little response by the immune system. But the other option is covering a certain area known as the beta 1-3 glucan. And this is how the body recognizes a fungal cell, which allows the fungi to quite literally hide from the immune system. With this covered, or considering it's from another planet entirely, the T cells may not even recognize it. And let's just say if it's from another planet entirely, it could also have a covering over its entire cell that just allows for the adaptive immune system to not be able to effectively deal with it, much like with parasites that escape our immune systems all the time. But considering that the fungus would inspire a lot of these mutations, this may also mean that it's influencing our genes, which by association, it may absorb information to use for itself, or it could be living within the cells themselves, allowing the fungus to stop the production of interferon, which allows for the cell to basically yell for help. And then by switching on and off genes, this allows for the formation, say, of giant teeth from the skull. So to wrap this up, essentially I believe it is an extraterrestrial fungus. As it enters the sinuses, lungs, brain, and abdomen, it has different effects based on the functionality of these areas. In the body, it may be able to enter the cells, influencing the actual genetic information of a person or DNA. Those fungi that have not yet entered cells would be noticed by the immune system as a response was launched. Depending on the strength of the immune system, this either bodied you or altered your physical form. The first form being the striker or sleeper. This resulted in changes in the body that reduced the thinking capacity to instinctual only and processing of external stimuli. And this really made them willing to eat anything. As the infection progresses, or you had a weaker response to the fungus, you would become altered into larger organisms whose ultimate goal is unknown. Really, likely it's just the continued survival of the fungus, which is really the goal of all living organisms. Now, really, the response should be to basically just nuke this from orbit and vaporize it, because if this gets out of the facility, then the whole planet is probably screwed. Point of this is, when you go to another planet and you don't know what's in the air, let's say it's an oxygenated environment, don't take off your mask and be like, I'm breathing the air, this is nice. Also, check what you're stepping in, and it's best to just decontaminate before you royally screw up your entire home planet. Because likely, if this stuff can float through the air in the facility, it was already floating through the air to wherever you went. Just some food for thought.